The sound of ice cracking echoes across the frozen wasteland as Anya Mikhailova steps onto the river that could become her grave. The thermometer reads -58 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze human flesh in minutes. Yet she clutches a worn leather satchel against her chest and takes another step forward. What drives a 43-year-old Yakut woman to risk her life every single day crossing this deadly frozen river? The answer lies not in what she carries, but in who waits for her on the other side. In the remote village of Kobyaka, deep in the Sakha Republic of northeastern Siberia, the concept of impossible doesn't exist, it's simply another word for Tuesday. Anya had learned this lesson 30 years ago when she first arrived as a young teacher. Fresh from Yakutsk with dreams of educating children in one of Earth's most unforgiving environments, the university professors had painted romantic pictures of inspiring young minds in traditional communities, but they had failed to mention the brutal reality of daily survival in a place where winter temperatures regularly dropped below -70 degrees Fahrenheit. What she hadn't expected was that the village school would be built on the wrong side of the Lena River, separated from most of the families by a stretch of water that freezes solid for 8 months each year and runs treacherous for the remaining 4. The original Soviet planners had chosen the location based on topographical maps drawn in Moscow offices, never bothering to consult the indigenous Yakut people who had survived in this landscape for thousands of years. They had placed the school building on the sunny side of the river, reasoning that southern exposure would provide more natural light and warmth during the endless winter nights. What they failed to consider was that this location put the school across the river from the village's main residential area where generations of families had built their homes in the shelter of ancient forests that provided protection from the brutal Arctic winds. The morning ritual began at 4:30 a.m., while the aurora borealis still danced across the star-filled sky like the spirits of ancestors celebrating another day of survival. Anya would rise from her small wooden house, the floors so cold that her bare feet would stick momentarily to the planks as she hurried to the wood stove. She would stoke the fire that had burned through the night. Letting it die completely was a death sentence in temperatures this extreme, and prepare her daily armor against the cold. 3 layers of wool underwear that her grandmother had knitted decades ago, each piece blessed with traditional Yakut prayers for protection. Reindeer hide pants that had been cured using methods passed down through 20 generations, waterproofed with bear fat and reinforced with sinew at every stress point. A thick down jacket that had belonged to her grandfather, a legendary hunter who had survived the Stalin purges by disappearing into the wilderness for 3 winters, living off the land in his accumulated wisdom. The felt boots lined with rabbit fur came next, crafted by her aunt using techniques that predated written history. Each boot contained layers of grass that would absorb moisture and provide insulation, changed weekly throughout the winter to prevent the deadly frostbite that claimed toes and feet from the careless. Over these went mittens so thick she could barely bend her fingers, but thick enough to allow her to handle metal tools without instant frostbite. But the most important item was always the leather satchel worn smooth from decades of handling, containing lesson plans, books and art, supplies wrapped in waterproof plastic, along with emergency supplies that could mean the difference between life and death if something went wrong during the crossing. The river crossing stretched nearly half a kilometer of open ice, and during the deep winter months when temperatures plunged below -60, the ice could be thick enough to drive a truck across safely. The Lena River froze from the bottom up and the top down simultaneously, creating layers of ice that could reach depths of over 6 feet in the deepest cold. But Anya had seen too many snowmobiles disappear through weak spots where underground springs kept water flowing beneath seemingly solid surfaces. She had witnessed experienced hunters who misjudged the ice thickness and paid with their lives, their bodies not recovered until spring thaw revealed the price of their overconfidence. The river demanded respect, and those who forgot this lesson rarely lived to remember it. She made the journey on foot, testing each step with a long wooden pole her father had carved for her from birchwood, blessed by shamans and hardened in fires that burned sacred herbs. The pole had been carved with traditional symbols meant to provide protection and wisdom, and after 30 years of daily use, it had become an extension of her own senses. She could feel vibrations through the wood that would warn of unstable ice, sense the different densities that indicated safe passage versus deadly traps. Her father had taught her to read the ice like a book written in a language older than human civilization, where the slightest change in color or texture could reveal secrets that meant survival or death. This particular February morning felt different from the thousands that had come before. The aurora had been unusually active the night before, sheets of green and blue light cascading across the sky in patterns that seemed almost alive. The Yakut elders always said that dancing spirits in the sky meant changes coming to the earth below. And in a culture where survival depended on reading subtle environmental signs, such warnings were never ignored. As Anya approached the river's edge, she noticed something that made her pause and reconsider her route. Fresh wolf tracks leading directly toward the school, pressed deep into snow that had fallen only hours earlier. In 43 years of life in Siberia, she knew that wolves venturing this close to human settlement usually meant they were desperate, driven by hunger that overcame their natural fear of humans or protecting something valuable enough to risk human contact. Wolves were not naturally aggressive toward humans, but a desperate wolf was unpredictable, and a protective wolf could be deadly. She studied the tracks more carefully, noting the size and gait pattern that indicated a large animal, probably female, moving with purpose rather than the wandering pattern of a hunting pack. The ice sang beneath her feet as she began the crossing, a low harmonic groaning that experienced Arctic travelers learned to interpret like a complex musical language. Good ice hummed with deep, steady notes that resonated through the soles of her boots and up through her bones. Dangerous ice cracked and popped with sharp, irregular sounds that sent survival instincts screaming warnings to anyone wise enough to listen. The ice talked constantly during temperature changes, expanding and contracting with sounds that ranged from whispers to gunshots, each telling a story about the hidden forces at work beneath the surface. Today, the river was telling her a story. She didn't like the unusual warmth of the past few days. Temperatures that had crept up to only -30 had been working beneath the surface like invisible saboteurs. The seemingly solid surface concealed pockets of instability where flowing water had prevented complete freezing, creating honeycomb structures that could collapse without warning under the weight of a human body. These hidden weak spots were the river's deadliest secret. Impossible to detect until it was too late to save yourself from the frigid water below. Halfway across, Anya's testing pole suddenly plunged deeper than expected, disappearing through what had appeared to be solid ice. She froze instantly, distributing her weight carefully across her snowshoes, feeling the ice flex slightly beneath her feet with a nauseating sensation of walking on something alive and unpredictable. Through the clear surface, she could see dark water flowing just 3 inches below, deadly reminder that the Lena River never truly stopped moving. Even in the heart of winter, when the surface appeared solid as concrete, the water temperature hovered around 32 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to remain liquid but cold enough to kill an adult human in less than 2 minutes through rapid heat loss and cardiac shock. But turning back was not an option, had never been an option in 30 years of crossings. In a small school building on the far shore, 17 children waited for her arrival, depending on her presence for more than just education. Some walked 4 kilometers through forest paths that wound between trees older than human memory. Paths their grandparents had carved following animal trails that led to the safest crossing points. Others, like young Pavel Dmitriev, had parents who worked the diamond mines 300 kilometers away, returning only on weekends, leaving their children dependent on the school not just for learning but for the hot soup and warm shelter that kept them healthy during the brutal winter months when temperatures could drop to levels that made human survival seem impossible. Anya carried more than books in her daily journey. She carried the future of an entire community, the hopes and dreams of families who had chosen to remain in this harsh landscape rather than abandon their ancestral homeland for the easier life of southern cities. Each lesson plan in her satchel represented hours of preparation under lamplight, researching ways to make mathematics and literature relevant to children whose daily reality included survival skills that urban dwellers couldn't imagine. She taught algebra using calculations for firewood consumption and food storage, literature through traditional Yakut stories that carried survival wisdom disguised as entertainment. The wolf tracks reappeared on the school side of the river, more urgent now, leading directly to the small log building that had served as Kobyaka's school for over 60 years. As Anya approached the structure in the pre-dawn darkness, her breath creating clouds of ice crystals that fell tinkling to the ground, she understood what the tracks meant. Huddled against the school's entrance, barely visible in the blue twilight that passed for dawn during the Arctic winter, was a small shape that didn't belong, a child unconscious and alone, covered in a thin layer of frost that made her look like a forgotten doll left outside by careless hands. Anya's medical training kicked in immediately. Protocols learned during mandatory first aid courses that every Arctic resident completed. She recognized Masha Petrov, a 7-year-old whose family lived 12 kilometers away in a traditional hunting cabin that had been built by her great-grandfather, using techniques that required no modern tools or materials. The child's lips were blue beneath a mask of frost, her breathing shallow and irregular, classic signs of severe hypothermia that could progress to death within minutes if not treated immediately. Her small body was curled in the fetal position that hypothermia victims instinctively adopt to preserve core body heat. But the position also indicated that her body's natural warming mechanisms were failing. But what shocked Anya more than finding a lost child was what lay beside the unconscious girl, an adult wolf, clearly injured with blood frozen in dark patches across its thick winter coat, positioned protectively next to Masha as if deliberately shielding her from the Arctic wind that could kill through exposure alone. The wolf's body was curled around the child's smaller form, sharing precious body heat in an act that defied everything Anya had learned about predator behavior during her decades in the wilderness. The wolf raised its head as Anya approached, yellow eyes meeting brown ones in a moment of interspecies understanding that transcended language and cultural boundaries. This was no random encounter between human and predator. Somehow, this wild creature had found a lost child in the vast forest and led her to the only source of warmth and safety for kilometers in any direction. The wolf's breathing was labored, visible in puffs of steam that indicated internal injuries, and Anya could see a deep gash across its shoulder, likely from fighting off a bear or another predator that had threatened the child during the long deadly night. Working quickly but carefully, her hands shaking from cold and adrenaline, Anya unlocked the school with keys so cold they burned her fingers even through thick mittens. She carried Masha inside, the child's body frighteningly light and cold, like holding a bundle of sticks wrapped in frozen clothing. The wolf followed weakly behind them, limping on one rear leg but determined to stay close to the child that had protected through the night. The building's heating system hadn't run since the previous evening, and the interior temperature was only slightly warmer than outside, but it provided crucial wind protection that could mean the difference between life and death for both child and wolf. Anya lit the wood stove with emergency kindling she always kept prepared, dry birch shavings and paper that would catch fire even in extreme cold. The flames caught immediately, and she gradually fed larger pieces of wood into the fire. Knowing that heating the building too quickly could cause thermal shock and a hypothermia victim, she wrapped Masha in every blanket she could find, including the emergency sleeping bag she kept for situations exactly like this. Then began the delicate process of gradually warming the child's extremities to prevent frostbite damage. As the school began to heat up, filling with a blessed warmth that meant survival, Anya turned her attention to the injured wolf. Against every piece of wilderness training she'd ever received, every warning about the unpredictability of wild animals, she offered the wounded creature water and the emergency food supplies she kept for hungry students. The wolf accepted both offerings, its intelligent eyes never leaving Mattia's still form, maintaining a protective vigil that continued even inside the human structure. In 40 years of living in the Siberian wilderness, Anya had never witnessed anything like this scene. A wild predator not only refraining from harming a vulnerable human child but actively protecting her from the elements that would have claimed her life within hours. The wolf had recognized something in the lost child that transcended the ancient predator-prey relationship, had chosen cooperation over competition in the face of mutual survival needs. When Masha finally began to stir as warmth gradually returned to her small body, her first word was not for her family or even for food. It was wolf, spoken with the trust of a child who had been saved by an unlikely guardian. Through chattering teeth and with words interrupted by shivers, she told her story. She had been separated from her parents during a hunting trip when a sudden blizzard struck with the fury that Arctic storms could unleash without warning. Lost and growing weaker as hypothermia began to shut down her body's functions, she had curled up against a tree to wait for death when the wolf found her. Instead of seeing prey, the animal had somehow recognized a creature in need of protection. It had shared its body heat through the endless night, then guided her to the school when dawn broke with the intelligence that suggested more than mere animal instinct. The wolf had led her along paths that avoided the deepest snow and strongest wind, choosing a route that a human pathfinder would have selected for safety and efficiency. By 7 a.m., Anya's students began arriving for the day, following their usual paths through the forest with the casual competence of children raised in an environment where survival skills were learned alongside reading and mathematics. What they found was a scene that would become part of local legend: their beloved teacher sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the warming fire, a rescued child in her lap, and a wolf sleeping peacefully nearby with the trust of a domestic animal. The older students, who had learned emergency procedures as naturally as city children learned traffic rules, helped Anya care for both Masha and her unlikely savior while someone rode a snowmobile to alert the child's frantic parents. The younger children stared in wonder at the wolf, asking questions about why it had helped instead of hurt, beginning conversations about the relationship between humans and wild animals that would influence their understanding of the natural world for the rest of their lives. But the story's most remarkable chapter was yet to unfold. As word of the rescue spread through the village communication network of radio calls and messenger visits, people began sharing other tales, sightings of a wolf with a distinctive shoulder scar that had been spotted near the school throughout the winter, always at a distance, never threatening, as if keeping watch over the building and its occupants. The elders remembered similar stories from their grandparents about wolves that seemed to understand the importance of the school, the vital role it played in keeping the community alive through the darkest months when survival depended on cooperation and shared resources. These stories revealed a pattern that had gone unnoticed for decades. Wolves in the area had consistently avoided hunting near the school, had warned of dangerous weather changes through their behavior, and had even guided lost travelers toward the building during blizzards. What the community had dismissed as coincidence was actually evidence of an ancient understanding between species that predated written history. Mattia's father arrived within hours, tears freezing on his cheeks as he held his daughter, his relief visible in the way his entire body seemed to collapse with the release of fear that had driven him through the night. An experienced hunter and tracker who could read animal signs like written text, he examined the wolf's paw prints around the school and followed the trail backward into the forest, reconstructing the previous night's events with the skill of someone whose life depended on understanding animal behavior. What he found challenged his understanding of survival in the Arctic. The tracks showed that the wolf had not simply stumbled upon Masha. During routine hunting, it had been systematically searching for her, following scent trails with the determination of a search and rescue dog, investigating areas where a lost child might seek shelter with strategic intelligence that suggested reasoning rather than mere instinct. The veterinarian from Yakutsk who flew in to examine the injured wolf discovered something even more extraordinary. The animal was not entirely wild. She was a hybrid, part wolf and part domestic dog, likely descended from the working dogs that had served Yakut communities for thousands of years. Her unusual behavior stemmed from genetic memory, an inherited understanding of the relationship between humans and canines that had allowed both species to survive in this harsh environment for millennia. The partnership between humans and dogs in the Arctic went back to the dawn of human settlement in the region, a cooperation so essential that it had become encoded in the very genetics of the animals that chose to live alongside humans. As winter deepened into March, the hybrid wolf remained near the school, never approaching during class hours but visible at the forest edge during Anya's daily river crossings, as if understanding the dangerous nature of her journey and providing silent companionship across the deadly ice. The children named her Nayeli, a Yakutsk word meaning "I love you," and began leaving small offerings of food near the tree line, creating a relationship that honored both the animal's wildness and its protective instincts. Parents who had initially feared having a predator near the school came to see Nayeli as a guardian, a living reminder of the ancient partnership between humans and wolves that had made survival possible in the world's most challenging environment. The presence of the hybrid became a source of community pride, proof that their traditional knowledge about cooperation with nature remained relevant in the modern world. The real test of this unusual relationship came in April, when the spring thaw made river crossings impossible for nearly 6 weeks. Every year, this period forced the school to close temporarily, disrupting the children's education and leaving working parents without childcare, forcing families to make difficult choices between economic necessity and child safety. But this year was different, marked by changes that began with Nayeli's behavior. The hybrid began appearing at the river's edge each morning, pacing and whining with obvious distress, as if trying to communicate something urgent to Anya during her frustrated attempts to find safe crossing points. The wolf's behavior was too specific to be random. She would lead Anya along the riverbank, stop at certain points to scratch at the ground, then continue searching with the persistence of someone looking for something specific. Anya followed the wolf's behavior to its logical conclusion, trusting in the animal's superior environmental awareness. If Nayeli could guide a lost child to safety, perhaps she could guide the experienced teacher to a safer crossing point that human observation had missed. The hybrid led her 3 kilometers upstream to a narrow section of the river where seasonal ice dams created natural bridges that lasted weeks longer than the main crossing, hidden from casual observation but perfectly safe for careful foot travel. For the first time in the school's 60-year history, classes continued through the entire spring thaw, allowing students to complete their academic year without the educational interruption that had always marked this season. The discovery of the alternate crossing point revolutionized village life, providing access to hunting and fishing areas that had been unreachable during previous spring seasons. But the most surprising discovery came when Anya researched the school's history in the village archives. Dusty records kept in a wooden chest that contained the accumulated wisdom of decades of community life. She learned that the original school location had been chosen not by human planners working from topographical maps, but by following a pack of wolves that had consistently denned in the area each winter for generations. The Yakut founders, wise in the ways of Arctic survival, had recognized that wolves, with their superior environmental awareness and instinctive understanding of shelter and protection, had identified the safest and most sheltered location available. For 60 years, the school had existed in harmony with these ancient hunters, though most people had forgotten the original reason for its placement. The building stood where it did because wolves had deemed the location worthy of protecting their most vulnerable pack members, and that same protective instinct had extended to the human children who now used the site for their own survival and growth. Nayeli eventually returned to the forest as summer arrived and the need for her protective presence diminished, but not before teaching the village an invaluable lesson about survival in extreme environments. The children learned to read weather patterns by watching her behavior, to identify the safest ice by observing where she chose to drink, and to understand that cooperation between species wasn't just possible, it was essential for thriving in the world's most challenging places. As another winter approached and the cycle of survival began anew, Anya realized that her daily journey across the frozen river had become more than just a commute to work or even a testament to dedication. It was a pilgrimage, a daily affirmation of the values that made civilization possible in places where civilization shouldn't exist. Every morning as she tested the ice with her father's wooden pole and scanned the tree line for a familiar gray shape, she carried forward the message that had sustained her people for thousands of years. We survive not despite the wilderness, but because we learn to live as part of it. The worn leather satchel still contained lesson plans and books, but now it also carried something more precious: stories of courage, cooperation, and the unexpected ways that life finds a way to flourish, even in Earth's most unforgiving corners. Each day's crossing was no longer just about reaching the other side safely, but about honoring the ancient compact between humans and the natural world that made survival possible for all species willing to work together. Years later, when former students returned as adults to visit their childhood school, they would search for tracks in the snow around the building's foundation, hoping to catch a glimpse of the legend that had taught them their most important lesson. Sometimes the greatest heroes come in forms we least expect, and the most powerful protection comes from understanding our place in the larger web of life that connects all living things in relationships of mutual dependence and support. What's the most extraordinary example of animal intelligence or cooperation you've witnessed in your own life? Share your stories in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible tales of survival and heroism from the world's most remote places.